I'm coming from another island, basically equivalent in size to Iceland, I should say, and well, maybe even about 3,000 kilometers larger. We're stuck in the Atlantic as well, North Atlantic, experience very much the same things. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Just to give you a little idea, you can see in the picture up there on the left side is our research facility. We're stuck on a fjord, beautiful location in St. John's. So I'm going to talk about salmon in Newfoundland, but I'm also going to talk about my experiences that I've had in Norway and elsewhere as well. And so we're going to talk about breeding systems, and so we're actually going way up into the river. It's going to be focused basically on sex. Everybody likes that subject. And I'm going to talk about how salmon do it and the influences of that on the dynamics of population subsequently. So what do we think about as a mating system or a breeding system? Basically, it describes an animal's reproductive allocation, the mating behavior that goes on, and then ultimately how that's going to influence the population subsequently. How does the dynamics that is happening at that stage influence what we see in the populations that we come back, the offspring that are produced, and what happens subsequently? So we're going to set the stage by looking at this. We're going to look at reproductive investment. And I want to look at the trade-offs between offspring produced, their survivorship, and the future breeding that's going to go on. What happens there? How does it occur? And I'm going to look at salmons in general to start off with and try to place Atlantic salmon in that system and see where Atlantic salmon sit among salmons in terms of their reproductive allocation and investment. And so we can see a number of patterns, hopefully, that arise from that. Now, the first thing I want to present to you is basically the percent of the total energy that these animals use during reproduction. So how much of their investment, that energy that they have stored through their life, is used during reproduction. And we've broken it down into two components. We have the Iteropara species. Those are the species that will breed more than once. And then there's the Semilpara species that are what we call big bang breeders. They breed just a single time. That's the Pacific salmon. And you can see that on the y-axis, the amount of energy expended, that the Pacific salmon, given that they're big bang breeders, not unexpectedly, are investing more in reproduction. So they actually have a greater energetic investment. And then on the other side, with the Iteropara species, where we also find Atlantic salmon, which are shown in red here, their investment is somewhat less, but it is still quite significant. You can see that those individuals, but particularly with Atlantic salmon, are investing about 50 or more % of the energy they have available when they come to the breeding grounds in reproduction. So that's a huge investment, and that has consequences for their life history, what they do subsequently. And we can then look at another measure of investment, and that is if we look at how much investment does the female put into eggs. And so what we have here is what we call the gotosomatic index. It's a measure of the weight of eggs that a female is producing relative to her body weight. So just to give you an idea of how much investment's going on. And again, this is broken down comparing resident fish that aren't going to the sea, compared to those anadromous fish that are going to sea. And we can see that the anadromous fish, those that are going to sea, are investing more in their gonads than the resident fish. So we can see that even within species, and we can see, particularly I've circled Atlantic salmon here, and we can see that those that are anadromous, the populations that are anadromous, are investing more in reproduction in terms of egg production than those are resident. And you think about resident populations of Atlantic salmon, and you think that they're fairly uncommon. Where I come from, there is probably at least 100 populations of resident salmon that never go to sea. So it's quite common where I am, and they just persist in lakes and ponds and do not go to sea. So they're quite common where I am, and it's an alternative life history strategy that we see exists in those populations, and they're investing less in reproduction than those that are going to sea, that are actually accumulating those resources from the sea that allows them to grow large. That investment between going to sea, coming back, also affects the chance that they're going to repeat breed. Are they going to live more than once to breed again? And so this again shows you that those resident fish, that are not going to sea, have a much higher probability of surviving to breed again than those that have gone to sea. So there's a true investment difference and consequence of that investment difference if you go to sea. So salmon go to sea, they actually have a less chance of repeat breeding. And you can see this shown here on the very far left side, showing that the salmon actually have a very low level of repeat breeding in general. But it can be quite significant in some populations, and I'll show you some examples subsequently. So you can see that usually with Atlantic salmon, repeat breeding, come back and breed again, varies around 7 to 10%. But there are some populations in Canada that can increase up to 40% of the individuals that are bred once will repeat breed in a subsequent year. And this is an example of work that we've been doing in Newfoundland on the North Shore. If you see the island of Newfoundland shown there, and there's a star there showing the location of the study population we're working on in the North Shore of Newfoundland, and we looked at the repeat breeders. So you can see that this is a picture of a fish that is leaving, having bred, it's on its way back to sea. It survived the breeding process, it's heading out. And in Newfoundland, we call these slinks. So obviously they're so thin, they look so like there's not a chance of survival when they go out, but they will come back and they'll look something like this. And it's quite common in these populations, we call them consecutive breeders. So they will go out for basically 2 months, and they will recover a lot of the energy that they lost during reproduction in that 2 months. And the number of individuals, so there's 63 days that they're out there at sea, they come back, and how quickly and how much do they grow during that period? Well, in terms of body length, it's only a couple of centimeters increase in body length. In terms of their weight increase, it's over 100% increase in weight. And we were talking recently in a couple talks earlier about capelin and the importance of capelin. Here is the capelin that comes to shore during the summertime. They're instrumental in these fish being able to recover and come back and breed again in the subsequent year. And when we have 25 to 30% of those individuals coming back to breed again, it's a very important component of the populations and the dynamics of those populations and their sustainability. So we need to think about these repeat breeders as an important component of the populations. And Jaakko talked about it a bit yesterday in his populations at the Tana. So we've set the stage at this point looking at reproductive investment. There's clear trade-offs about investment into reproduction versus the likelihood of repeat breeding. And this has effects on individuals and what's going to happen to the populations. It's going to affect the genetics and the dynamics of the population subsequently. Now I want to focus on understanding individual breeding patterns and how that shapes things. And in order to do that, we're going to focus on natural and sexual selection that's occurring during breeding. And this is basically the framework to think about it. So we think about this in general evolutionary ecological terms. And here I'm going to focus on what I call the operational sex ratio. And that's the number of sexually active males relative to sexually active females on the breeding ground at any one time. And that's going to shape the intensity of selection that goes on amongst individuals to be successful during breeding. And the basis for this comes from a very basic difference between males and females. And that is related to the size of the gametes they produce. Females invest in larger gametes than males. They produce eggs. Males invest in sperm. They produce thousands, millions of them. So they're much cheaper to produce, generally speaking, and they produce a large quantity of them. Females also invest a degree in what we might call parental care. They create the nests in which the eggs are going to be put in, so there's investment in time and energy involved in that. Males are not investing in that at all. So if we think about Atlantic salmon, we know that the salmon typically breed for a month or so, maybe more. The spawning season lasts that period of time. The males can be reproductively active over that whole month plus. Females, they will create a series of nests and deposit their eggs, and that's all typically done within about 5 to 6 days by a female. So she's finished in 5 to 6 days. So what typically you find out there is there are many more males competing for access to females during the breeding season. So it creates intense selection amongst the males for access to breeding opportunities. So as we see here, that operational sex ratio is biased towards males. It creates intense competition amongst those males. They're not so interested in mate choice, they're interested in accessing mating opportunities. Alternatively, females are not competing the same way for resources and mates. They're actually competing for resources, I should say, but they're also competing for, in terms of selectively mating with particular males that will offer them the particular resources, the genetics potentially, that are valuable to their offspring and the survivorship and performance of their offspring. So that sets the stage of what's going on. Of course, the environment's going to influence that, how aggregated the populations are and where females are, allows males to aggregate and control things. There's also the basic sex ratio. If there's more males than females in the population, that will change things. But that's all involved in what sets the stage for the selection that's going to go on. And just to give you a feel for the intensity of the breeding competition that's going on, there's a couple of photos here. One is the male, you can see in the foreground, spawning with the female slightly behind him, and that's spawning, and in the process of spawning, quickly a second male darts in to release sperm, and you can see that male slipping between the female and the first male in that second photo in the tense competition. And just to give you a feel, you don't think there's a lot of fighting and competition going on. Here's a male attacking a second male. Now this is a brown trout, I apologize, but it's the very same thing with Atlantic salmon. So intense competition occurring between these males for accessing females. And so during spawning, you will see that many of the males will come away with wounds and ultimately they actually have higher mortality than the females during the breeding time. It's created the evolution of special reproductive traits. These fish have evolved to breed and successfully breed, and the males develop a series of specialized characteristics. And we know the kype on the Atlantic salmon. It's quite common. And there's a picture here at the very top. And then there's a diagram showing what's happening in this transition that goes on. So as the fish returns to breed, its head morphology changes. It loses its feeding teeth. It develops in its elongation of its snout. It doubles in length during that period just to breed. And those feeding teeth are replaced by more canine-like teeth, simply to fight. Of course, they're not feeding during this period. They're simply trying to access mates. And of course, they also develop this elaborate breeding coloration, simply related to competition for mates as well as mate choice. And at the same time, they have these weapons. This kype is a weapon. They also develop shields. The skin thickens at this time to deal with the attacks that individual males will receive. So it's a clear evolution of these traits that are going on. But it also influences another component of the life history that we really haven't talked about here yet. And that's the idea of early maturation. So there's alternative reproductive strategies that have evolved in this system. Competition is intense. And so males are fighting. Is there an alternative way by which males can access breeding opportunities? And the way they do this, it's an alternative life history. The males will mature in many populations as par. So they'll never have gone to sea, but mature as par. And these par will be an important contributor to the populations and the gene flow that's going on. And the evolution of this is dependent on their frequency in the population because it changes the competition. More par, more competition amongst par, fewer competition amongst the big, large anadromous fighters. That influences it. And it depends on their condition. They have to be a certain size, a certain robustness in order to develop the gonads in order to take on this alternative strategy. And it's thought to be related to a genetic liability in the population. Basically, there's a threshold that the individual has to attain within body size before it matures early. And it's an important contribution. And we can see in populations, I'm not sure what it is like in Iceland and in the Six Rivers, but I'm sure it occurs, and I'm sure it occurs in relative frequency. But across the distribution of Atlantic salmon, it's known to vary from 2% of the males to 100%. Every single male in the population maturing as a par always before it's goes to smolt. So large contributions, lots of males doing this early maturation phenotype. Just to give you an idea of how they're competing, these guys are less than 1% of the weight of the anadromous fighters they're competing with. And they're using a sneaking tactic. They're little sneakers. They sneak into the nest. They get very close to the female. In fact, you can see in this photo, you can see the anal fin of the female, where the eggs are going to come out the ovipositor there. And the males, these little sneaker males, are very, very close. They're in fact closer than the large anadromous male is, the eggs as they come out, so they can be the first to release their sperm there close to the females. And they've seen in populations estimated sort of the genetic contribution of these males can vary from about 11% of the egg, fertilizing the eggs in the population, upward over 50%, up to 65% of the eggs in a population can be fertilized by these early maturing males. So it's a very important genetic contribution to the population. It influences the genetically effective size of the population, and they're an important component. So this just illustrates, that's the gonosomatic index, showing that these guys are investing, they don't invest in those secondary sexual traits, the kype and the bright coloration. They're sneakers. They invest their eggs, their investment, their energy in the size of gonad they produce. And it's shown here. The clear bar is the early maturing males, and the solid bar is the anadromous fighting males. And basically, they're investing about twice as much in the size of the gonad as the anadromous fighters. And you can see that the picture shows the size of the gonad. Basically, it's filled the body cavity. The males are investing huge amounts in sperm production. And I wanted to give you a little feel for some of this. And this is some experiments that we've done. Again, we're using pit tagging, like we've talked about, but in a different approach. Here we use pit tag antenna. You can see it's shown there. It's placed around a nest. And we actually have the small par tagged with pit tags so that we can monitor when they approach the nest, cross into the nest, and come out. And we have cameras that are synchronized with the pit tag antenna so that we can actually observe them through the camera, and we know exactly the individual that crossed at a given time, and so we know their behavior during that nesting episode. So we conducted a series of experiments, and these experiments involved, and they were replicated, they involved 12 males and 12 female anadromous fish fighting for spawning opportunities, and then we had 20 par in those arenas to test their breeding competition and breeding success. This gives you an idea, a picture of what the results we would get from the pit tag antenna, and you can see that there are a series of par on the upper figure. They range from 1 to 11 that were potentially present prior to the spawning with the female. You can see that there are 3 males, 1, 2, and 3 were present for a number of hours before the spawning. So this ranges from 6:30 to 10 in the morning. You can see that there's a little expanded area. That's the area expanded around the breeding event itself. You can see that during the breeding event, there was males 1 and 3 were present. They were in and out around the female. Male 1 is shown in the solid line. Male 2 is a dashed line, what they were doing during that spawning event that we've expanded out here. And you can see that male 2, even though he invested a huge amount of time being present and risk from being attacked by the anadromous fish, but didn't actually participate in the spawning and missed out. So we can get a good picture of what's going on. And we can look at the participation through time, and it's shown here that it's varying seasonally. The green dashed line is the number of spawnings we had through that period of time that we were doing these experiments. And then the blue dots are the number of par that were present per each spawning event. And it varied seasonally, such that early in the spawning season we tended to have much more numbers of par present per spawning than we did it later in the breeding season. So something was changing that way. We also measured the cost, and there's certainly a cost. The males are investing in gonads. There's a cost and energy investment there. The cost in their presence at the spawning events that leads to decreased growth because they're not feeding at the same time. And there's a cost in terms of injury. We saw that about 3% of the par died during this period of time. In fact, at the end of the experiment, we used to scan the females and the males, and we found that we picked up some pit tags in the stomachs of females. So they'd obviously eaten the mature par that were present at their nests, defending it. And 30% of the individuals had some sort of injury from attack by the anadromous fish during that period of time. So it's a true cost for these males to do this behavior and take on this life history. And this figure shows you the distribution of the number of par per spawning. Varies from, typically it was 1 during the experiments, but it went anywhere up to 9 individuals participating in the spawning during that period of time. So, and in essence, when we looked at all the spawnings that we observed, there's 133 of them, 113 involved participation by the par, so they were present in about 85% of what we see. And that's probably very typical of what we're going to see in nature. And again, this has an important component to altering the genetics and the gene flow that goes on with these populations, and the importance of these males in contributing to the size, the effective size of the populations. And sometimes we typically forget, we don't think about them, we think primarily about the anadromous fish during this period of time. Now I want to briefly give you a feel for what the implications are. So I've talked about the basic understanding of the mating system. I want to talk a little bit about, well, what does this tell us that might be of value to us trying to understand interactions and things that are going on in mating systems. So here we're going to look at an escapement event that happened on the south coast of Newfoundland, in which about 20,000 nearly mature farm fish escaped one fall. We went in, this is work led by Fisheries and Oceans and Ian Bradbury, and then categorized the number of offspring that were of farmed origin, hybrid origin, or pure wild origin after that event. And we found that 17 of the 18 populations that we surveyed had clear evidence of farm salmon genetic contribution to these populations. We also found that hybrids were much more common than pure farm fish, and that's what we would expect understanding the mating system of Atlantic salmon. We know that males are under intense competition. We find that the farm males, we would expect them to be less successful at breeding, and that's what our experiments show. They are much less successful in breeding than the farm females, and those farm females are somewhat less successful than the wild females. So we know that the hybridization that's going to go on between those populations is going to be driven mostly by farm females mating with wild males. And that's what the results that we're seeing here, and results we've seen in experiments at other times. So that gives us an insight into the first level of introgression and genetic change that's occurring because a consequence of escaped farm fish. But what happens in subsequent generations? If we follow the same population through time and looked at the hybrids, what do we know what's happening in terms of hybridization further down the road in these populations? So we're looking at the same populations, but we're looking at them 5 years later after that big escapement event. And we can see here that primary type of hybrids present in the population are back crosses with wild fish. So these are hybrids or farm fish that have bred again, but they bred with wild fish. This has occurred fairly quickly, and we know something about the importance of mature male par. These par can contribute to the populations, particularly if they're farmed or hybrid individuals. All they need to do is survive in fresh water. They don't have to go to the ocean before they breed. They can breed quite rapidly in the new environment, and that we know from previous experiments that the breeding success of these par, whether they be farmed origin or hybrid origin, is equally or better than the wild par. So what's happening here, it's very indicative of what's happening, is that these farm par and hybrid par are major contributors to the further gene flow and introgression that continues in the population in subsequent generations. So understanding the mating system provides us insight into what's going to happen further down the road in terms of the genetic introgression and the changes that are going to happen to these wild populations because of escaped farm fish. So we've looked at competition for mates and its importance. We've looked at how that's shaping trait evolution and potentially genetic structure of those populations. But what role does the female have to play in the dynamics of populations. And I want to wrap this up by really looking at the female role now. So Olivia showed us a picture yesterday in her modeling of basically the relationship between fecundity and the body size of a female. And that's the red figure shown here. But if one goes in and looks at the real contribution of those individual females based on their body size, it does not follow the relationship we see with fecundity. It's more of an exponential relationship, and that's what's shown here in the yellow. So that larger females are making a more important contribution than simply measured by their fecundity. So that's an important consideration. So large females are more important than simply the number of eggs that they're producing, and we're comparing that to smaller females. And how does that happen? So basically, it relates to what they're doing with their eggs, where they're spawning them, when they're spawning them, and how much they're investing. So we talk about maternal investment, we're going to look at three things. The size of the egg the female produces, which will probably influence things, the breeding time, when she breeds, and the breeding location. All these potentially influence the population. So key to understanding the evolution of reproductive allocation in females is this trade-off. We can think of the ovary as a pool of energy. The female has a choice. How does she divide that energy up? She can divide it up into large eggs, but if she does that, she produces fewer of them. She can produce smaller eggs and therefore produce many more of them. So there's this trade-off between egg size and fecundity. So how is that balanced, and what is the importance that's going on? So this is some experimental work we did just to look at the importance of egg size. And here we compare females with small and large eggs, and we look at the relationship between offspring performance and the quality of the habitat that they're in. And so along the x-axis is habitat quality, as shown along the bottom, and on the y-axis is the growth rate of those juveniles after they emerge from their nests. So this is the very first period of time when they're out in the environment feeding exogenously on prey. And we can see that as habitat quality increases, the value of large eggs decreases. So in good habitats, the value of a large egg is less. In poor quality habitats, it's more important. So there's this trade-off about the habitat quality in which the females are breeding, influencing their investment in the size of the egg that exists. And we also see that this varies from population to population. The average size of eggs in populations will vary from place to place, and potentially reflecting the habitat quality and the expectation of the environment that their offspring will enter into. And that's being selected through time. Another experiment was looking at breeding time. And we've talked a little bit about the temperature component through the talks earlier yesterday. I want to focus on breeding time here. And again, what we've done is a series of experiments. We basically took a female's eggs. She was spawned and fertilized, had those eggs fertilized by a single male, and we had it fertilized immediately, and then we had a delayed fertilization for about a week to 10 days later. So we had paired groups of eggs, ones that were fertilized immediately, early, and then ones that were fertilized late, and we could compare the selection that was going on in those different groups of eggs through time. And so we followed these fish from the period of emergence, and you can see that actually there's this experimental setup here. It's composed of paired nest boxes in which we could trap the offspring as they emerged from the nests. We would tag them, mark them, and then could follow them subsequently. And then we looked at their growth and mortality 14 days after they emerged, and then 44 days after that. And we can see there was clear selection on a couple of things. The early breeder, the early emergers, the early fertilizers had a significant body size advantage over those that emerged later. This is related to competition for the environment, and of course they could begin feeding earlier than those that emerged later. And also, those later emergers suffered increased mortality. So there was a clear role for breeding time influencing the dynamics and the success of individuals when they emerged from their nests. Of course, we didn't do the experiment where we actually made the female spawn prior to what they would normally do. which would probably push the fish into a time when there wasn't sufficient food available. But you can imagine a dynamics in the population where it's an optimal time to breed, to have the offspring emerge, both in terms of available food and temperature at that time. So important component. So the last point I want to make with regards to this is comparing nesting location. And we talked about, I think it was Leonard who talked about, I say maple, I'm not sure you got your name right, but we'll go with the English term as well. But we think about how many fish or eggs we need to stock a population. That's how we categorize whether a population is meeting its goal. But we don't think about the distribution of those eggs in those populations. We think of it as sort of a conventional density. We think about what's happening there if we look on the right side where the nests are distributed evenly throughout a stream and there isn't any real density dependence occurring. But actually what happens is we have to think about the effective density that's occurring in populations. And if females tend to breed in particular areas, it's going to increase the density in those areas. And that density is going to influence the level of competition the juveniles are going to expect when they emerge, because they're going to remain very resident and close to the nest sites. And that's going to influence things like growth and survival subsequently. And experiments looking at this, comparing an evenly distributed distribution of nest sites to a clump distribution, clearly shows that there's effect on the growth rate. When they're clumped, the growth rate of the fish is more constrained because of density-dependent components than it is if they're distributed evenly, as well as the survivorship similarly. And this is something we really need to think about, is how females are distributing their nests within the environment in that they exist, and how that ultimately is going to affect the dynamics of populations. So, just to wrap up, basically we see that things are shaped by reproductive allocation, competition for mates, competition for breeding resources and breeding sites, nesting time, and that's shaping trait evolution, the dynamics of populations. It's shaping the genetic structure and the offspring performance. And ultimately, it's setting the stage for the dynamics of the populations in the future and what's happening. So finally wrap up and thank and acknowledge the people that contributed to the work. This is over a couple decades, certainly, of work. Thank you.